So in this video I want to talk about nerve cells, which are actually called neurons. And we want to talk about what these neurons look like, so their structure, and then how they work, so their function. So this is about neuron structure and neuron function. So neurons are nerve cells. They're specialised cells which make up the majority of the nervous system. And these little guys, these neurons, are responsible for transmitting information, for integrating that information, so making sense of it, and then for coordinating and regulating activity in the body. So you can see they have really diverse functions, and consequently, because they have such diverse roles, they have to have a really specialised structure. And this is what a neuron looks like. So you can see that it looks very different to what a cell that what we've spoken to up until this point looks. It's not kind of rounded or flat. It's got very specialised features. And we're going to talk about what each of these are. So most cells we've talked about before are kind of a rounded shape, and they have a central nucleus. And this is no different for a neuron. But this area here is called the cell body or the soma. As you would expect in any cell, the nucleus contains the DNA, just like what we've learned about so far, and it contains within the cytoplasm a number of organelles. So we have things like mitochondria, which of course produce energy. And neurons are actually large consumers of energy, so they need to use up lots of these, they need to have lots of these energy-producing organelles, the mitochondria. They also have lots of ribosomes in them, and you might remember the ribosomes are responsible for producing protein. And neurons produce a lot of a particular protein called neurotransmitter. So neurotransmitter is a particular protein or a particular group of proteins that transmit nervous information, and we'll talk about these in more detail later. So you can see we've got our cell body, and our cell body has these main kind of housekeeping functions, but then we have really specialised structures coming from the cell body. So you can see that we've got these projections up here, which are called dendrites. And the dendrites are responsible for receiving information. Well, what do they receive that information from? Well, generally it's from another neuron. So another neuron with its cell body and its dendrites projects what's called an axon down and terminates at these dendrites. So the information is received by the dendrites, and then it's collated in an area here called the axon hillock. So we've got information being received by the dendrites, making its way to the axon hillock, and then the axon hillock decides whether or not the information is worthy of being acted upon. If the information is deemed to be necessary to elicit a response, it will send an action potential down the length of what is called the axon. So this area down here, extending from the cell body to what's called the axon terminals, is simply there to propagate information from point A to point B. So this axon allows action potentials, and we'll talk about these later, to go from the soma down to the axon terminals. At the axon terminals, neurotransmitter is released, neurotransmitter that we talked about. Neurotransmitter is released to transmit information to the next neuron, just as happened back at this point here. So you can see that this axon contains a number of these pink sort of squares, and these pink squares themselves are called myelin sheaths. And the myelin sheath, it's simply responsible for providing a faster passage of the action potentials down the length of the axon. So let's talk about that all together. Here we have our neuron, and we can see that we've got our dendrites as shown in each of these areas, and they just receive the input. Exactly what we've said before. We've got our cell body or our soma in this area here, containing all the organelles necessary to keep the cell alive. Our axon hillock was present here at this region, and it's responsible for integrating the information received by the dendrites and then determining whether or not it will cause an action potential. The axon extends from here to here, and it conducts information in the form of action potentials from the cell body down to the axon terminals. These axons can be myelinated, as is shown in these regions here, and the myelination increases the rate at which the message is conducted, or the conduction speed. And lastly, we have our little axon terminals which is where the information is passed from one axon onto the next by the formation of things called synapses, or connections with the next cell. So that's what a neuron looks like. That's what a neuron does. But when you actually look at neurons in the real deal, you can see that they come in many different forms. So what I've shown you is a very stylized version of a neuron, but they can take many different appearances. So you can see that all of these neurons are different depending on their function, but they all have a cell body. They all have dendrites, and they all have axons with axon terminals.